what this shows is that the situation since 2000 simply can't occur. It simply can't happen. Because, as the graph on the chart, on the handout that the Friends of Science have given you shows here, the CO2 is increasing, but the temperature is going down. This is what Thomas Huxley, who was a contemporary of Darwin, said, it's the great bane of science is a lovely hypothesis destroyed by an ugly fact. So in other words, what the IPCC said in their 2007 report, and those reports, by the way, are the basis of all government policy, this simply shouldn't be happening. That alone is enough to throw the whole hypothesis out, but it hasn't happened. What do we know about CO2? In every record of any duration, for any time period in the history of the world, the temperature increases before the CO2. Now think about what I'm saying. The fundamental assumption that I showed you was that if the CO2 increases, the temperature will increase. There isn't a record anywhere that shows that. In fact, every record shows exactly the opposite. The main assumption of the hypothesis is shown to be wrong. And yet, it continues to be the basis of policy and driving the whole world energy and economy and everything else. That alone is sufficient to throw out the whole hypothesis. But of course, we're not dealing with science anymore. We're not dealing with a hypothesis that's tested. As Richard Lindzen said, the hypothesis came out and it was accepted as fact right away. The consensus was reached before the research had even begun. And that's exactly what's happened. But of course now there's two things happening. One is that the research is showing that it's wrong, and the facts are showing that it's wrong, as this cooling is evidence. There's no correlation between atmospheric CO2 and temperature at any point in the 600 million year geologic record. None whatsoever. In the ice core record, it shows temperature and CO2 going up and down, and I recall this, when that came out, the French Jouzel, they produced this graph, and there was excitement everywhere. This is absolute proof of CO2 causing climate change. And Jouzel himself said, don't rush to judgment. He didn't put that down in here. I remember that being said in an interview. He said, don't rush to judgment. Well, of course they rushed to judgment. We now know that in that ice core record, the temperature changes before the CO2, not as was originally assumed. They rushed to judgment because it supported their idea. The third thing that we know about CO2 is that there's a maximum amount of temperature increase that can occur with a CO2 increase. So in other words, CO2 does trap heat. That's the first assumption. We acknowledge that. But there's a maximum amount of heat that it can trap, and it's already at saturation. In other words, if you double CO2 or triple CO2, there'll be virtually no more ability to trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere. We're at saturation. That's been in the literature for some time. This is a graph that Willis Eschenbach produced to illustrate it. On the left, it shows what happens with temperature increase with 20 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. The easiest way I found for the public to understand this, because this is always the problem, is getting analogies that the public can understand, is I call it the black paint syndrome. If you want to block the light coming through a window, you put on a coat of black paint. That effectively blocks most of the light coming through the window. You can put a second coat of black paint on with exactly the same amount of paint, but the amount of light that it reduces is significantly reduced. In other words, that CO2 up there is trapping and holding as much heat as it can, that increasing the amount of CO2 has virtually no effect. So that's called the saturation. Now, one of the latest developments, and again, there's huge argument, and by the way, one of the best measures of whether something has a whole lot of truth to it is the degree to which it's attacked. The degree to which certain groups and certain websites focus on not only the evidence, but the individual. It's become almost a measure of provability, if you want, is the degree of attack. I must apologize, I can't pronounce his name very well, but Dr. Frank Miskolsky, he was doing research for NASA. He was using real data. He was using radiosonde data, that is, by balloons going through the atmosphere. And he wasn't looking for what he found. And that is one of the most powerful things in science. It's called serendipity, and I love that word. That you're looking for one thing and you stumble across something else. And of course the beauty of that is that it means it wasn't tainted by your objective. It was not subjective. It was a purely objective finding. And what he found was that the atmosphere is saturated for all greenhouse gases. Not just the CO2, as I've just illustrated to you. That's already been in the literature. But what he found was that it applies to all the greenhouse gases, what Jennifer Merhosi defines as climatically saturated greenhouse effect. There is a greenhouse effect. Nobody's arguing that. And by the way, you can go out in the street there and ask anybody to explain it to you. That very few can. Very, very few can explain it. They confuse global warming with greenhouse effect and all of these other things, but that's part of our difficulty. The Earth's temperature is 33 degrees Celsius warmer than it should be. It should be minus 15, but because of those greenhouse gases trapping that heat, it is plus 15, it should be minus 18 and it's plus 15, so the total difference is 33 degrees Celsius warmer. But what Mizolsky is saying is that that is pretty constant over time, and that it doesn't change as the gases in the atmosphere, as the greenhouse gases change. What he's saying is, then, that the greenhouse gases can vary all they want, but they're essentially saturated. Therefore, you're left with the conclusion that what's causing global temperature change is changes in the sun and changes in geothermal energy. But certainly what Mizolsky is showing then is the greenhouse effect is there, it's true, but it's not a factor in temperature change. Dr. Roy Spencer, a former NASA employee who resigned, now working at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, produced a recent study that showed that the Mauna Loa CO2 levels vary with the sea surface temperature. And that seems to support Mizolsky's idea that the temperature of the sea surface is affecting the CO2 levels at Mauna Loa. And of course the sea surface temperatures are a function of the solar energy, the amount of heat received into the upper layers of the ocean. And so that supports the idea. He found in his study at Mauna Loa that, the temperature precedes the CO2 by 6 months. And so again, that basic assumption that proves incorrect. So that the sea surface temperatures have been declining. The cooler water is absorbing more CO2, and we're starting to see that in the Mauna Loa record. There's been a slight decrease because of that change. And what he's showing there is the GIS, the Goddard Institute of Space Studies model prediction for what should be happening with the accumulated heat from the oceans and the possible lower limit. And then at the bottom you see the actual observed. So again, the difference between what they were predicting and what is actually occurring is huge. It's not even in the same ballpark. And that's a critical point. Because science is about prediction. If you cannot predict, you don't have science. And you do your hypothesis, and if it doesn't predict, you go back and either throw out the hypothesis or you keep adjusting it till it does give you accurate predictions. And of course what we see everywhere we turn is the predictions that they've been making simply don't hold up. Every temperature prediction of the IPCC from its formation was wrong. Some of them by 400%. But that's ignored, because they keep coming out with new predictions and saying, well, ignore the fact we've been wrong up to now, this is correct. It's incredible how they've got away with it. It is public relations. They're unable to hindsight forecast. This is a technique I learned about very early in my career. If you take a model, a climate model, and run it backwards, it should be able to recreate conditions of the past. The computer models can't do that.